Alright, let's go ahead and wrap up this little look back at the original Rocky franchise with the last two, which are the much beloved, sarcastically of course, Rocky V, and then Balboa, where it kind of came back, and it was the whole thing of aged Rocky kind of fighting, and how it almost took kind of that pretty meta approach of people seeing the trailer. I remember specifically in 2006 seeing the trailers for Rocky Balboa, and a lot of people were like, "Oh, is he really going to be still fighting at that age?" Which is pretty much the question of the whole movie, which it answered very nicely. But before we get into the, I think, great success that was Rocky Balboa, let's kind of talk about the one that's kind of the most despised of the group, I guess you could say. The one with the really bad reputation. All the way up to Stallone himself, who seems to not be able to stand the movie. Uh, but despite the fact that he, all the way up to the end of this franchise, this portion of the franchise, before we got to the Creeds, Stallone wrote all of them. But the interesting thing about Five, and really its reputation, is the fact that it sees the return of John G. Allison directing, who directed the original movie. And you kind of get this sense of the whole thing being this coming full circle kind of thing, where we get the original director back, and then through choices that Paulie made and other problems, they end up back pretty much right where they started on the in these streets of Philadelphia, and he's in the attic and he finds his old clothes and he puts them back on, the old hat and the jacket and everything, and walks around. And it feels like we've really come full circle. And what's interesting about this is, to my understanding, it was always to not only just build up an ending to the franchise, but there was the whole thing about how this would have been we would have seen the death of Rocky in this movie originally. And it actually feels like that's pretty established going in, even though the movie doesn't actually end that way. It does seem like a relatively good enough setup for that, to get to that point. Because we start off immediately like we do every time, after the fight at the end of the previous movie. And it was to my understanding that they were supposed to do something else. Like have somebody, I think he wanted to do like a Drago spinoff or something. That would have been like parallel to Rocky. But it turned into, why don't we do like the aftermath of boxing, like the health aftermath, and how your health deteriorates, and just the general dangers of the sport, and how we see, like, Rocky's brain damage and how it affects him, and how he after the fight he like literally can't stop shaking. And it's a pretty harrowing scene and a harrowing setup to him, especially watching him from the beginning of the franchise and then up to this point, to where he's gotten beaten so hard to this point that he's like barely himself. Like, it's clear that he's still in there, but it's like there's something else. There's even the point in time when his son, who like randomly aged like 5 years in between, and during that Drago, the fight with Drago was very, very long. So when he comes back and he goes to Paul and he says, like, there's something different about Dad. And you can really see where like the layout for the drama is here. And we do get that weird moment when, like, it's this really dramatic moment where the kid's like, there's something different about Dad, Uncle Paulie, and then we get the cut of Rocky, and he's telling Adrian, like, I'm gonna violate you like a parking meter, whatever that means. And then she quips about, him needing a quarter to do so, or something like that. And it's like, I mean, if that's different, then that would make sense too. But, what is interesting about this is how much we're revisiting everything. We even get a new scene with Burgess Meredith. Like I said, there's actually something really poignant about a lot of the movie, despite its reputation, despite its like really hated reputation. There is some really strong stuff in it, and some stuff that and stuff that seems like it was kind of carried over. Like, it's almost like Rocky Balboa is kind of a loose remake of Rocky V, just with the added thing of he's just older. Because it's the whole thing where we're circling back around and we're going through all these past relationships and how they've affected Rocky all the way up to this point, and how they've stuck with him, mainly the one with Mickey. in this really good scene, and just these really sad scenes where not only did we just sense just how much Mickey is missed, like you get a sense when we see Mickey again and actually get to see him have another scene, the hole that he's left since he died. And then just the whole idea of him going back to the gym and it just being really run down inside. It's just so like sad and depressing, and just really shows how much has happened and how much has changed from way back then, and how the events of the first movie might seem like yesterday, but then like time just passes so quickly, and it can almost become like this really existential thing. And you see like Rocky almost like he's reaching the end of a road, and he's kind of realizing, maybe this does have to be it. Because we've been going back to his injuries being very concerning for the past few movies. With Adrian especially really stepping in and saying, no, seriously, we've got to stop now. Like, this has to be your retirement. Like, that last one was your last one. Because you're going to fucking die if you don't. And how much focus the movie puts on that is really good. And then, of course, we add in we're finally getting, like, a real up-close and personal look at the relationship between him and his son, especially with an added layer of poignancy because he's played by his actual son, the sadly late Sage Stallone. And it's at this point where we get some strength, but then we also get into where the movie's weaknesses are, because there could be something here about, like, Rocky Jr. having to live in his shadow and stuff like that. Something, once again, that's explored a lot more in Balboa, or a little bit in Balboa. But the fact that he goes to school and he's just kind of bullied. He's bullied by these little dorks that just, like, smoke by the walls or something. You realize how long it took me to realize the fat kid was Kevin Connolly from Entourage? It was a while. And going into that direction, where it turns into this whole cliche thing of basically Rocky neglecting him, and it's like we were talking about, though, what the Rocky movies have done so well up to this point is how they handle cliches and how they're so well executed. You get so caught up in it, you even forget they're cliches. You forget it's the kind of movie you've seen over and over again, because they bring back the same feeling to you every time. They're that powerful. They're that well done. But here we've got a lot of other things going on besides that, and it's like we're kind of getting back into that vibe, or trying to get back into that vibe, where we were talking about how after Rocky II, Stallone said that he ran out of ideas, so he just focused on the fighting in 3 and 4. So 3 and 4 was just nothing but montages and fighting, with occasional emotional beats, losing Mickey and Apollo, but mostly fighting and mostly montages. And so here you can see him trying to go back to that whole, let's put the drama in it and save a fight for last. But we still get a lot of fights because of the introduction of Tommy Gunn, who is the person that he takes in. And it's right away in this scene where Tommy's introduced, you get the sense that the storytelling is not quite as organic as it probably once was. When we get this very bizarre scene of all the major characters in the movie just converging in the same place all at one time. It's really weird. Because he's just walking with Paulie, and then Tommy Gunn walks up and he's like, hey man, he's trying to like pitch him and say like, hey, you want to train me? I want to show you what I have. And then Adrian like comes in, and because the pet store's right over there, and then Duke comes in, the promoter, and then just everything's happening all at once. And you get the sense it's supposed to show like how overwhelmed Rocky is by everything and everybody. But it's, like I said, it's not exactly organic storytelling as far as these are all the problems all at once, and these are all the directions we're going to go in. Duke in particular, which is also really confusing because we've already got a recurring character named Duke, Apollo's guy, who's still here. But now we've got another character named Duke, who's basically our antagonist, or who's absolutely our antagonist. And he might as well be Don King, I guess. And he's the one that's like really, hungry for this fight and what all the money they can bring in if Tommy becomes a really big fighter and all that shit. So he takes him in, and we're treated to. One of the things that really brings the Rocky movies to life in a way, and really just brings all that emotion, like something you can just hear immediately. And it's like, we're in it. This is exactly what we came here for, and this is what we love about this. This is what gets us to the feeling. Like, this is, like, this, not even just the Rocky franchise, this goes outside the Rocky franchise. The feeling you get when you hear Bill Conti's music in a Rocky movie is why you love movies at all. Like, not just Rocky movies, but just movies in general. It can make you feel that. It's that powerful. And we have pretty much sacrificed Bill Conti almost entirely for a hip-hop soundtrack. I don't really know what's going on with the music in this movie, but there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect from the franchise and from the emotional feelings that the Rocky movies bring to us, with this very different turn. And you would think that's one aspect, and how could it really change that much? Yeah. I would go so far as to say one of the biggest things about Rocky is the music. Okay, we're doing a hip-hop soundtrack now, however that may or may not fit. And in the meantime, Rocky Jr. feels really neglected because he was training Tommy, and there's... I don't know quite what they were trying to accomplish here. There's definitely ways they could have brought more emotion to this, and things like the scene where Rocky walks him to school. If the Rocky Jr. scenes have been like that consistently, it would have really been something. Like I said, just the fact that it's his actual child, you already get the sense of that connection. Like, there's something there that's underlying anyway, that's really bringing something to the table. But it's... after a while, it's just a really forced plot contrivance to get conflict in there that really doesn't need to be in there. Or at least as stretched out as it is. But I also think, we were talking about the holes left by Mickey and Apollo, and how much that Mickey scene hits because of this. It's worth noting, obviously, this is our first movie without Apollo, and I feel like there's a really big hole there as well. Like, it's one of the ways you can kind of get a sense that the movie might really suffer for. Like, if there was actually... I know you can't, like, resurrect Apollo, and it'd probably be... To bring him back in the sense they brought back Burgess Meredith for one scene, probably would have been forced. It would have felt like too much bringing in the other characters, and it would have been like, oh, they're just using a crutch. But that's the thing, though, is they kind of need the crutch, because it still feels like there's a really big hole here where, like, a couple of Apollo scenes would have really added something and really brought a certain energy to it, or a dynamic to it, that's now just not there. So there's not really anybody for him to have that dynamic with, now that he's lost Mickey, he's lost Apollo, and Adrian's kind of a background player for a while, and just kind of there to say, like, you know, this is gonna kill you and all that, and get Rocky to stop doing the things that's going to eventually kill him if he keeps going. Because there's usually at least one moment with Adrian that's this really, really nice moment. Where, like, you know, one is basically their love story, and the Apollo story is also there. And then the second one is she's very much a part of the emotion. She's, like, the whole emotional core of the movie. And then in the third movie, I think the third movie is the one where they have, like, the little pre-anniversary scene. Even the fourth movie, that was busy doing nothing but montaging, still had a room for that moment where Adrian showed up and was on the porch at the end when he came back. And in that moment has it. Like, there's not really anything like that with Adrian that I can remember in this one. It's like she really, really took a back seat here, unfortunately. And that's something else that really left a big hole. So, basically not having much Adrian and not much of the love factor, and then no Apollo, no Mickey, there's gaping holes in this movie where the stuff that made those other movies so special is clearly missing. And usually, even if they weren't, like, always big, memorable characters that brought some kind of depth, the fighters always brought some sort of new energy. Like, Clubber Lang and Drago didn't have much going on outside of being the opposing fighters. But they were still, like, really memorable, and Clubber Lang especially brought a lot of, like, energy. And then just Dolph Lundgren's, like, coldness brought a lot to Drago. And the whole thing Drago had going on where he was, like, basically being used as, like, a political pawn, and him trying to break through that. There was something there. There's not... I don't really get much out of Tommy. Tommy's just kind of the pawn between, you know, Rocky and Duke. And then Duke is just some, you know, kind of cut out villain, really, like any other villainy promoter in any other sports movie, pretty much. So there's just all that stuff that really made it special is missing. But like I said, we do have those poignant moments in here. It's just once the movie kind of gets past like the half-hour mark or so, all the stuff that's not working starts to take over, and I think that's what people tend to remember the most when they talk about how much Rocky V is basically the black sheep of the Rocky franchise. But I mean, we still get scenes towards the end, like the whole Paulie arc kind of coming to a head. One of the things we continuously talking about the whole franchise is how much we love Paulie and how much we despise Paulie, back and forth, and how that's a whole intentional thing with his character. But it almost seems like it really comes to a head here at the end when he stands up to Tommy in defense of Rocky and then like takes a punch for it. Like really, like it felt like Paulie's character really kind of reached his final moment. Like we had that moment of clarity in the fourth one where he finally broke down and said, "Hey, I know I'm really hard to be around and really hard to like, but you know there's still love here." And it's like to finally get this moment kind of feels like the final cherry on top of that moment. We always need reminders of why Paulie should be here, and we get those reminders, and we're like, okay, so yeah. It's good that Paulie's here, even if he can be very hard to like. And then this eventually gets to the street fight, which I've heard people praise the street fight, you know, for being different and being a bit brutal, but I've mostly heard that the street fight only continues to distance us from what makes the Rocky movies, and I think I fall more into that camp. It's definitely... There's definitely something here where it's, without having, like, you know, the ring and a big build-up and the whole sports quality to it and all the spectators. There's clearly spectators here, but, like, a whole, you know, arena of people. It's... This street fight doesn't quite live up to that. So, and then as it goes on... And it gets more and more ridiculous as it goes into slow-mo. It does, like, the slow-mo deep voices. There's that moment when, there was the whole dispute about when Tommy stayed with them, and how he was going to take the basement, and Rocky Jr. is going to have to move him with Paulie. And we actually get that moment that I'm still not entirely sure if it's supposed to be a comedic moment or not. It should be pretty clear, but it's honestly not. When he's pummeling Tommy... And then we get one of those mini slow-mo zooming close-ups of all the people. And when we get one of Rocky Jr., he says, like, "Get him, Dad, knock him out." And then very dramatically, "He took my room." I still have no idea if that's supposed to be a comedic line or not, because everything around it is super dramatic and super, like, everything trying to be as hectic as possible. I don't know. But it's really... I think that's what I think the street fight would be cooler if it didn't have all the... Like, 80% of it is zooming in on spectators and going into slow-mo. It's like seeing the spectators in slow-mo. Like, the fight being in slow-mo is one thing where it's like, just show us the fucking fight in real time. But to focus on the spectators in slow-mo is a weird choice. It's so fucking weird that Allison did this one. Like, you look at the first movie and then this one. There's so much... It's weird. It's weird how much a director can disconnect from his movie with 3 other movies between it. I don't know what happened. But yeah, then you get the whole idea where you can get the sense that Rocky was supposed to die, but there is a relief that he didn't. Like, I've come to realize that how upset I would be if Rocky died on screen. Like, when Creed came out and we got to the whole plot with Rocky in Creed... I was terrified we were gonna, like, lose Rocky on screen, and, like, I was so relieved. And when his, like, cancer isn't even mentioned in Creed 2, it was, like, usually I would criticize that, like, you're just gonna drop that, and it's like, I'm glad they dropped it, because I don't think I could handle if Rocky died on screen, or died in a movie in between. Obviously, as we go on, people start dying off screen, but, yeah, I'm kind of glad that we were able to keep Rocky around. So that'd be one case where I'd usually say, oh, they copped out or oh, they didn't go the distance, but I'm okay with keeping Rocky around, especially since we got the follow-up movie, the movie where it was like Stallone hates Rocky Five. And he's not shy about that. He hates Rocky Five as much as Clooney hates Batman and Robin. And like he'll tell you any chance he gets. So the way he responded to that by making Rocky Balboa is like the almost the epitome example of this is what I was trying to do. This is what I wanted to do. I don't know what happened before, but this is what that should have been. And like I said, like there are parts of it where it almost feels like kind of a loose remake. Just we're in what would have been the present day of 2006 with the time jump. And in a very interesting choice, one of the very first things we learn is that Adrian has died off screen. And I haven't quite looked into what his reasoning was. I don't know if it was a getting Talia Shire thing or if it was Stallone's choice from the get-go. Like it added a certain emotional gravitas to it because it does feel very inherent to the story, the grief that Rocky's going throughout it and how motivating that is for what the direction the movie goes in. And the fact that we lose Paulie off screen between this and Creed, and it's like somehow the off-screen deaths actually surprisingly work, as abrupt as they might seem, especially given how crucial the love they had was. But the thing is, it's like the way the love lives on, where it starts off and he's at the cemetery, and there's that whole thing, the thing that continues throughout Creed, where he's got the chair like in the tree, is just a touch that I've always loved so much, and the fact that he hangs out there that often. And it's like in the way they utilize that in a way to where it is basically like Adrian is still there, like literally there in spirit. Like you can just say offhand, "Oh, she's there in spirit," but the way the movie portrays that is really effective and does make it feel like she's still there in a way. And the whole way they like do the scenes where like he goes back to his old place and we see the sort of faded image of Adrian from the first movie at the bottom of his steps. And it's like, this is like really heavy stuff, especially if you're watching the movies close together. It can hit really hard in a really good way. And it's like, it's definitely an emotional... It was like how Rocky V was missing so much of the emotional factor. So Rocky Balboa went like tenfold into the emotion. And it's like so much the foundation of the rest of the movie. You can really feel it going back to its roots in that sense. Which is great, and we see all the callbacks, and this is a case also where it's like, it's not, it could seem like maybe fan service, or like it's like just living on callbacks to the original movie or stuff like that, but it's really a sense of feeling like it's kind of coming full circle. We already kind of got the full circle vibe in Rocky V, where they had to come back to Philadelphia and, you know, like live back in the smaller places, and you know, the fame is still there, but it's not like keeping him rich or anything. Like he's past that, he's past the prime and everything. But when you see stuff like him with like Cuff and Link, and to my understanding, Cuff and Link are still alive, like even now, and like Rocky Balboa is 15 years old already, which is crazy. So that's still happening, and then just that constant air of sadness as he walks around, and like he goes to the pet store, he goes to the gym, and like the signs falling off, and then and you can see how, and he goes to where their first date was, where like everything is, you know, bulldozed down. It's like you could see people maybe complaining that this is just like, you know, fan service or all that stuff, but it's like really reaching those moments and like seeing somebody at the age that Rocky's at now, and how it seems like the only thing, and he and Paulie even get into this, where it's like, it feels like there is no more forward, it's all what he had, and how he's kind of stuck in that area, and then the movie ends up becoming about, you know, moving forward, in the famous line of the movie. But there's also these little touches, like the fact that not only does he have a restaurant now, but the fact that his name is Adrian's, and it's just like, just seeing that just hits in all the right ways. And then Spider Rico hangs out there. The dude from the very first match we ever saw in a Rocky movie. The very first scene of any Rocky movie. and the fact that that guy's still hanging around, whether Rocky likes it or not, he's around, and it's also, it really brings you into this world and really brings you back to the connection you have with the characters. It may make you realize you had more of a connection to the characters than you even realized. It's so, even before we're really getting into the meat of it, it's just worth noting this is a really beautiful movie. Just, I mean, all the way through. And like, just when it's handling this opening stuff already, it establishes that. And then making the very interesting choice of his platonic friend throughout the movie being the girl in the first movie that said "screw off, creepo," or whatever it was, "screw you, creepo," when he told her to stop smoking. And to my understanding, it would have been interesting if it was the same actress, which it isn't. But to my understanding, the original actress of Marie did come back for Rocky V, but her scenes were cut. So they were able to kind of do a continuity thing here, where it was like he basically says he hasn't seen her since she said "screw you, creepo." Yet somehow remembered her, but I'm assuming we get the sense he saw her around because she's in the neighborhood. But still, the unexpected way this takes off in the platonic relationship that it does, is really nice throughout the movie. And like when he's talking to her, it's like he doesn't have a love story because Adrian's always going to be the love, and it'd just be kind of weird because he was an adult in the first movie and she was a kid, and even though she's clearly an adult woman now with a grown child of her own, it might still make scenes from the first movie a little weird if that happened. But the fact that they stuck to him saying, it's all, like, whether she's here or not, I'm all Adrian all the time. But the way he talks to her in that way, to where we can still see Rocky's charm, even if he's not, like, wooing her or anything, but just the way he's, showing off his charm, where we get stuff like when he's offering her the job, and he's still, like, charming as ever, and when she's getting ready to turn it down, he does that whole bit where he calls for the bus to run him over because she's turned down the job, and she says, well, a bus hasn't come through here in 20 years, and then he says, oh, that was close, or something like that, or that was a close call. And it's like, that's exactly the kind of thing he would have said, like, to Adrian back in the day or somebody. And it's like, to see that he's not lost any of that charm at all, and like, he's literally, this is Stallone playing the exact same character, like, 30 years after the fact. And it's, in fact, he'd be doing it 40 years after the fact, and Creed still really shows the connection to this character. And like I said, he got a reputation, obviously, throughout his career of being the action guy that didn't have much range in acting. But, I mean, just go to the Rocky movies. One thing I forgot to mention when I talked about the first movie was the fact that when we were talking about how he got an Oscar nomination for acting and writing the first movie, and the only other two people to do that, get nominated for acting and writing the same movie, are Chaplin and Wells. That's the list. Chaplin, Wells, Stallone. I shit you not. Because Chaplin had The Great Dictator and Wells had Citizen Kane. Stallone with Rocky is the only other one in that list. Which, I mean, and like I said, you really get the sense that he really gets to act his ass off in this one. Like, he really, like, you talk about how, you go back to the first movie and it's like, people wouldn't have given him a part like Rocky. He had to write it himself and give it to himself. In this particular case, you can see him taking full advantage of that, where he's like, if I'm going to get to show off my acting chops in this way, I'm going to have to write it. And he gets so much to do here on an emotional level. He gets the scene where he breaks down with Paulie at the meat place, when it's like where we see he's still confronting Adrian's death. And these are scenes like in quick succession too, because pretty much right after that, we get the scene when they're trying to deny him his license, as far as fighting goes. And the whole line about it's about how hard you can get hit, with Rocky Jr., that whole thing. Really, a lot of his back and forth with Rocky Jr. are really big moments also. It's obviously he's played by Milo Ventimiglia now. To my understanding, it was gonna be Sage Stallone reprising the part, but he didn't want to, like, because there was like the friction between them, he was afraid that audiences would take the relationship like too literally and think it was their actual one, and he didn't want it to go down that road, so they cast Milo Ventimiglia, who I think still works quite well, and actually really has the resemblance, at least as far as like Sage Stallone goes, to really fit into this part. And kind of have that back and forth of the whole living in the shadow thing kind of coming in from the seeds were kind of planted for that in Rocky V, and how they've kind of come over here. And it's surprising, like, talking about, like, the home team thing, and how much of Rocky V actually carried over into this and brought some emotional punch into some of the callbacks that are in this. It's very interesting in the way it kind of brings the franchise all together, like, not even, like, trying to shun the black sheep, like, saying, no, Rocky V is part of this family, is part of this franchise, so, it all comes together. And it's, I said, these really big emotional scenes he gets in quick succession, and he nails all of them. Even moments that are just the more mundane moments, like when he's reliving the memories of his fights with his customers. They're all, like, the whole thing just completely rings true, and there's such this, emotional thing throughout the movie that really builds up to what's ultimately going to be another fight. And I feel like we don't get as much from, like, the background of Mason Dixon as we do the other fighters. Certainly not Apollo, but not really, like, it's almost kind of like another Clubber Lang, just not as extreme. Because I do like that Dixon does have a place he's coming from as well, even if we don't quite get, like, into his head, like we kind of normally would. But the idea of setting up that he's got just as much to prove as Rocky does, even though he's, like, it was basically what was going on in Rocky 3, where it was, like, when Rocky had all the challengers, he was just knocking down, and then Mickey had to say, like, that's because it was set up that way. It's basically what Dixon is told, and it was set up like, oh, you're just taking down these, small fighters that don't stand a chance anyway, and, you may be the champion, but you're not really, there's not a whole lot of, like, respect or anything behind that, so both of them do have something to prove going in. I do wish we'd gotten a little bit more of Dixon and a little bit more of, inside his mindset. But it still establishes enough that they've both really got something to fight for, and they're both getting knocked down when they're both kind of on their own kind of pedestal, where Rocky has his legacy and people get behind that, and Dixon has his placement now of being, like, the current guy. But both of them are getting the same disrespect as well, and having to basically both prove themselves, with Dixon having to prove that he can actually knock down somebody that's not just some random person, and then Rocky has to fight to basically solidify his legacy and keep it alive. So, with that said, we get the montage. Not a montage. We get the montage. The Rocky montage. And it's amazing. The only addition is the dog, and that's perfectly okay. We love Punchy as much as we love Buckus, I guess. But the thing is, I paused because it's like Buckus just kind of disappeared after a while. I don't remember him even being mentioned. He got the Adrian and Paulie effect. We lost him off screen apparently. But still, once we get the montage, which has just, once again, it could be one of those things that you could dismiss as fan service, but if it doesn't work, you're soulless. and that's all there is to that. So then we get to the fight, and we get to Vegas, and then we get all these great moments of, like, the commentator fanboying over Rocky. Michael Buffer does the intro, and he says the thing. And I kind of love the authenticity of watching most of the fight with the HBO logo and the timer. And it really gives you the vibe of just how big this fight is on, like, a grand scale, in a way that we haven't seen the climatic fights be yet. And this is a stellar fight. This is another one of those, like, the Rocky franchise never lost its ability to get you standing out of your seat during a fight. To where it's even when you know the outcome, and it's like, I love how close the outcome is on this, and the way it kind of went back to its roots of there being a two-way victory, of both of them had something to prove, and both of them proved that thing regardless of who won, and how when Dixon is declared the winner, it's just as much of an afterthought as it was when Apollo won in the first movie, where it's like, that's not the point. And like I said, there's a lot of this whole fight, not just how, like, big and grand it feels compared to the others, and how it feels like the stakes are so incredibly high because we have such a bigger seemingly a bigger audience now, and how he's defending basically his whole legacy at this point. Like he's like in each movie, it seemed like he had one particular thing to defend when he was fighting, or one reason in particular to fight. And it's like, because this is such a culmination of the franchise, it feels like the whole franchise, the whole story is what he's fighting for, and how massive that makes it feel, and how just dead even this fight is. Like, Rocky succeeds so much in this fight, I sometimes forget that he technically loses it by, like, 1 point. But, still throwing in some of that stuff, like when it goes into Sin City color at some point, which kind of makes sense because it may have been Spy Kids 3, but still, he had recently worked with Rodriguez when this happened, and I'm wondering if he kind of got that a little bit from that, took inspiration from that, and really made this fight as cinematic as possible in this really big way. Like I said, in the Rocky fights don't even necessarily need help being completely cinematic, but this one feels like it kind of really went all in on feeling as cinematic as possible, which is great. And then once we do reach that ending, and then we fade out, we get something we don't typically get after a Rocky fight. Usually we just get credits, which is what's great about that. I love the way the Rocky movie is just ending go straight to credits right after the fight, because there's nothing else to say, there's nothing else to prove. But once again, it all comes back to the love for Adrian. Like, you go back to the first movie, and it's like, they're declaring Apollo the winner, but who's even listening to Apollo being declared the winner? No disrespect to Apollo, but all that mattered is that he was calling out for Adrian, and that Adrian was there. And all that's ever mattered was that Adrian was there. So that we finally get an epilogue after a fight, and it's the simplest thing ever. It's just him going back to Adrian and saying, "We did it." I am not going to cry, but I am really fucking close. And then it fades out, and then we get the whole thing of as the credits roll, we get the real footage of people climbing the steps who have been inspired by Rocky and doing the thing, and it's, like I said, it's just really, it's a really fucking beautiful movie all the way through, all through the end credits. Also, like, how can you not watch that footage during the end credits and not feel something, seeing what all Rocky has done, not just as a fictional character, but to these people that have potential. They could just be recreating the scene for shits and giggles, but they could also be people that were genuinely inspired, which is just as likely, if not more so. And then thus ends the story of Rocky as told by Rocky, as written by Stallone. Because then after this we did get those couple of Creeds, and I believe we're getting the third Creed as well, which I want to say Michael B. Jordan is directing, which will be his first time doing that, I think. I'm assuming that's still happening. But then of course Ryan Coogler took over, and he and his co-writers took over. But what I always found very interesting is that while Coogler very much has his own style, and really set a certain mood with those, and had, like, you know, the one-take fights and stuff like that, it feels like a lot of Creed's visual aesthetic comes from this last movie, Rocky Balboa. Like, it feels like Creed was almost a direct continuation straight from Rocky Balboa, not just in story and what we know, and him, you know, still being at the restaurant and all that, but just the general aesthetic. It feels like those movies go right in line with the other. So, like if somebody were to mistakenly think that Stallone directed Creed, or mistakenly think that Ryan Coogler directed Rocky Balboa, they wouldn't be, I wouldn't criticize them. And I love that they were able to carry that, while completely doing their own thing and telling their own new story. It just seems like there's so much respect coming from Coogler for what Stallone did throughout it. And I think that's something that really helped the Creed movies go forward, was just starting with that, and then going into their own thing. And making sure both were present, is so... I said, you just get such a sense of respect out of the Creed movies, and that's what makes it good. And the fact that it feels like a direct continuation from this just shows that how strong the stories are still going, so that's really great. So I think that's pretty much what I have to say about these Rocky movies. I did talk about the first Creed when it came out, and I talked about Creed 2 when it came out on here, but like I said, I think we're going to go a little bit more into my brother wanted to do something regarding Rocky IV and Creed II and talking about them together and kind of how they connect, just the two of them, which I'm very interested in doing. So we're gonna look into that. And then and then Rocky IV has that director's cut coming in November. So that'll be interesting to see how that changes things, but and see how much more or less we get of certain aspects of it. But as long as the robot's gone, we're good. So, speaking of Robert Rodriguez, who I brought up a little bit ago, he's going to be the next person we talk about. We're going to go into a trilogy, one movie at a time. And if you don't know what trilogy that is, you have no idea who Robert Rodriguez is. So I'm assuming you do, so I'm sure you know what 3 movies I'm talking about. So we'll be talking about those individually like we did this, and then go from there with all the other stuff, reviews and verses and stuff like that. So until the next thing, I think that's it.